I just want to acknowledge that we're speaking on stolen Kalapuya. So I'm going to start with a quote from a really great novel I just read called Lost Everything, which is a novel set in the future after civilization are due to ecological crises. In West Virginia, we had leveled a green range of peaks into gray wastes, spotted with the rusting yellow metal of abandoned machinery. In Pennsylvania and New York, we had drilled for gas until the rock broke and the water went bad. The towns that used to drink it died. We burned and we burned until there was more smoke than fuel, and then things started to come apart. The roads breaking into rifts of jutting asphalt. Libraries with caved-in roofs full of decaying books and dead monitors. We saw these things and yelled at each other. The system had been built on argument, believing any problem could be fixed, explained, weaseled out of, with enough money, the right words, until the problem was physics. And then there was only what we did and how the planet responded. It did not matter what we said after that we kept talking anyway, as if it was all we had. Called Lost Everything by Brian Francis Slattery. This talk is called Resistance Rewritten. So, I haven't been an environmental activist for very long, but it doesn't take much time to realize that there are a set of rules you must follow if you want to be taken seriously in this community. They're largely unspoken, a set of general premises you simply cannot question unless you want to put a quick end to a discussion, or worse, be branded as a radical nutjob and all-around bad person who's going to make it worse for all of us when you bring on a police state. Well, I already knew I didn't agree with these rules. I don't think I could have told you exactly what they were until I read The 5 Rules for the Game of Social and Political Change in the United States of America by Portland activist, author, and filmmaker Craig Roseborough. The first is that you have the right to pursue social and political change as long as you follow the rules below. All social and political change in the United States has come about only through nonviolent methodologies, and these are the only methods which are permitted to be used. With few exceptions, all activity must stay within the realm of behavior which is sanctioned or approved by the government. This directly relates to engaging in activities which are lawful and thus permitted by the government. One rare exception to rule number 3 has been the occasional use of nonviolent civil disobedience when unjust laws were broken for the greater good of society. While it is doubtful any unjust laws exist within the United States in current times, if an individual did decide to commit an unlawful act of nonviolent civil disobedience, he or she must be prepared to submit to all penalties under the law resulting from this behavior. And a note to number 4, on the extremely rare occasion when one may decide that a law is unjust and therefore should be broken, it is best to coordinate this activity with the local, state, or federal policing forces to ensure the safety of the participants and the general public. And the last is you have the right to pursue social and political change as long as you follow the rules above. So note the sarcasm, but understand these really are the premises under which most political activism takes place in this country. Breaking these rules puts you instantly in the activist penalty box. You're suddenly a negative, reactionary, naive, setting back the movement agitator, and once that happens, good luck shifting any paradigms or leading any mass movements.
That's all well and good until, like so many of us, you realize you simply can't ask a thing like all social and political change in the United States has come about only through nonviolent methodologies, without seriously begging that question. Has all social and political change in the U.S. come about only through nonviolence? A cursory remembrance of our high school U.S. history class should challenge that basic premise, but amazingly, among those who pursue social or political justice issues, including environmentalists, this theory of political change is accepted as the gospel truth, or at least close enough to the truth in terms of how history informs our modern political practice. So something a lot of this talk is going to cover is this relationship between history and our methodologies for social and political change is deeply important, and it's the primary subject of the panel. It's important because our understanding of history informs our strategy in the present. So our ability to imagine what's actually possible is shaped by our understanding of the past. And therefore, our actions in the present are also shaped by our understanding of the past. And right now, our actions in the present could not be more crucial.
200 species are pushed to extinction every single day. This is 1,000 times greater than the natural background rate of extinction. A Cornell research survey found that water, air, and soil pollution account for 40% of human deaths worldwide. According to climate scientist and former NASA employee, Professor James Hansen, rapid emissions reduction is required to restore Earth's energy balance and avoid ocean heat uptake that would practically guarantee irreversible effects and disastrous consequences. A 2012 report commissioned by World Bank warns of a planet on track to see 4 degrees Celsius average rise in temperature by the end of this century. This translates to overland temperature rises between 4 and 11 degrees Celsius. Arctic permafrost in the form of frozen organic matter contains almost twice the aforementioned emissions limit. Horrifyingly, a global temperature increase of 3 degrees C means a 6 degrees Celsius increase in the Arctic, resulting in anywhere between 30 to 85% loss in near surface permafrost. According to a 2013 study, completely contrary to a popular myth, global warming has accelerated, with more overall global warming in the past 15 years than the prior 15 years. This is because about 90% of overall global warming goes into heating the oceans, and the oceans have been warming dramatically.
So in the short term, we're already seeing the beginnings of the floods, the fires, the droughts, and the superstorms. California recently declared a state of emergency stemming from the worst drought in the state's history, in conjunction with unseasonably high rates of wildfires in January. In the oceans, zooplankton populations have declined 70% in just the last 40 years. Overall, the coral reefs are dying and oceanic dead zones are expanding at startling rates. On land, the largest living organisms yet known, old-growth trees 100 to 300 years old, are dying in mass. The fabric of life on Earth is collapsing, and humans are not exempt, though the effects aren't necessarily obvious from here behind the military barricade of the U.S. Empire. For example, the effects of climate change alone were responsible for 5 million human deaths in 2010, but 83% of those deaths happened in low-carbon emitting developing countries. We, not only the human we, but the global we of life on Earth, are facing a crisis on a scale the planet has never seen. And the reality is that environmentalists are losing this fight. It's no secret on some level, even if they're familiar with the research, I think more people than not can sense that something is terribly wrong. Something horrific is about to happen, and it's happening now.
It should be clear to anyone paying attention that in the face of all this, our government and the corporations, banks, and special interests that run it plan on business as usual. They will burn every last drop of oil, speck of coal, every whiff of gas. If there is fuel on the ground and wealth with which to buy and extract it, the existence of solar panels and bicycles notwithstanding, it will be dug up and burned. They will not hesitate to kill anyone who gets in their way. Right now, the strategy of the mainstream environmental movement has no hope of stopping them, or even substantially slowing them down. Humans are storytelling creatures, and our current strategy of the movement is a story with a beginning, middle, and an end. We need to ask whether that story matches up with reality and with the way social change has happened throughout history. So here's the story as it stands. By raising awareness about the issues, we will create a shift in consciousness. A shift in consciousness will spark a mass movement. A mass movement can successfully end the murder of the planet by using exclusively pacifist tactics.
So first we need to tackle the idea of a shift in consciousness. A recent popularization of the paradigm shift idea can be found in writers like David Portman, who bases his analysis on the idea of saying, the term the Great Turning has come into widespread use to describe the awakening of a higher level of human consciousness, and a human turn from an era of violence against people and nature to a new era of peace, justice, and environmental restoration. Another way that I've often heard this idea mentioned is in the form of the hundredth monkey myth. A primatologist named Lyle Watson wrote about a supposed phenomenon where monkeys on one island began teaching each other to watch sweet potatoes in the ocean before eating them. And myth has it that once that 100th monkey learned to do it, monkeys on other islands who had no contact with the original potato-watching monkey cult spontaneously began washing potatoes, exhibiting a kind of tipping point or collective jump in consciousness. The existence of this phenomenon has been fairly debunked, and even Lyle Watson himself describes and admitted to the fact that he fabricated the myth using very slim evidence and a great deal of hearsay. But yet, this hasn't stopped optimistic environmentalists from invoking the hundredth monkey phenomenon to defend the idea that though through raising our collective consciousness, by getting through to that hundredth monkey, will spark some sort of great turning of humankind away from the behaviors that are killing the planet.
Unfortunately, this line of thinking doesn't pan out historically. Let's take the example of the resistance against the Nazis and the genocide they committed, and let's look at some omitted historical information. In 1952, after the Nuremberg trials, after all the information about the atrocities of the Holocaust had become common knowledge, still only 20% of German citizens thought that resistance was justifiable during wartime, which, under the Nazis or any other empire, is all the time. And mind you, the question was not whether they personally would participate in resistance. It was whether they thought any resistance by anyone was justifiable. At the time that the Civil Rights Act of 1964 was passed, 80% of Southern whites still disapproved of giving legal rights to black people. So, raised awareness of the atrocities of the Holocaust and of American slavery did not translate into an increased willingness to support resistance. It was not a shift in consciousness that got the Civil Rights Act passed. It was the hard and dangerous work of organizing, protesting, putting pressure on the government, not by changing its mind, but by forcing its hand.
And the same unfortunate trend holds true about current efforts to educate about climate change. A recent Yale study found that raised awareness about the facts of climate change is not the most powerful influence on someone's attitude about the issue. Far more powerful on an individual's attitude are the attitudes of their culture and their community. So right now, the culture here in the U.S. is dedicated to downplaying the facts of the coming catastrophe and tamping down any kind of resistance. Our way of life depends on the very technologies that are killing the planet and that are causing climate change. It's next to impossible to make someone understand something that, like climate change, if their salary, much less their entire way of life, depends on them not understanding how. So none of this is intended to devalue education whatsoever. After all, if education were worthless, neither of us would be here doing this today. However, we do have to acknowledge that education is just the first step in creating movement. Building it up to anything more will leave you bound to be disappointed. It cannot be clearer by now that great turnings and paradigm shifts, if they happen at all, are not spontaneous or even necessarily voluntary, or even at that necessarily a good thing. Every day that we wait for some mythic shift in consciousness, some proverbial hundredth monkey, is the day we lose another 200 species. A day our air and water are further poisoned, another day that oppressed classes are callously exploited. The passivity of simply waiting for people's minds to change can only benefit those who are murdering the planet. All of this is to say that ideas can be powerful, but only if they get people to act. History tells us that more awareness does not often translate to more action. So let's take the focus off trying to change people's minds about the world and start focusing on changing material circumstances.
So part and parcel of this paradigm shift idea is the concept of the nonviolent mass movement, especially in environmentalism. You get people like Bill McKibben saying, I can't think of anything we can do except keep trying to build a big movement. There's nothing else that's ever going to do it. Before we can question the absolutism of this narrative, and more specifically pacifism, we have to get something out of the way. Because you see, you can't question nonviolent mass movements without someone closing their eyes, putting their fingers in their ears, and repeating the phrase, Martin Luther King Gandhi, over and over again. Anyone considering using these figures and the movements they belong to as justification for strict nonviolence needs to consider the following. Gandhi and Martin Luther King both operated under political conditions in which it was actually possible to force concessions from those in power. In Gandhi's case, the colonizing British were economically and militarily decimated over the course of 2 world wars that ensued in the same period as Gandhi's activism. There was simply no way Britain could maintain its rule over India faced with full-scale revolt, and both the Indian independence movement and the British colonial authority knew it. In Gandhi, the British saw something of a sycophant, with whom they could make deals and save face as they lost control of their colony. George Orwell once had this to say on the subject of Gandhi. As an ex-Indian civil servant, it always makes me shout with laughter to hear, for instance, Gandhi named as an example of the success of nonviolence. As long as 20 years ago, it was cynically admitted in Anglo-Indian circles that Gandhi was very useful to the British government. Despotic governments can stand moral force until the cows come home. What they fear is physical force. In the case of Martin Luther King and the Civil Rights Movement, geopolitics also provided a unique opportunity to force concessions from those in power. The 1960s were arguably the height of Cold War tensions between the Soviets and the United States. The U.S. government, like most egotistical abusers, was extremely concerned with its image in an effort to prove the superiority of the American political and economic system over that of the Soviets. The endemic racism in the United States and the unrest this led to were flaws the Soviets exploited again and again in anti-American propaganda.
Additionally, the Supreme Court in this period under Chief Justice Earl Warren was comprised of activist judges who defied their conservative opposition and expanded civil liberties and also federal power in an unprecedented way, ruling against segregation in numerous court cases. So under these conditions, the federal government was both motivated and able to intervene on behalf of the civil rights movement. Helping matters further was the reformist as opposed to revolutionary nature of Martin Luther King's demands to those in power. Ending segregation and enfranchising black voters, while vitally important and unquestionably strategic in ensuring greater safety and well-being for African Americans, were not revolutionary terms. They required no comprehensive structural changes to the economic and political system of the United States.
The next thing we should point out is that Gandhi and Martin Luther King led massive and sustained protest movements. With a level of organization and momentum the environmental movement has not, and likely will not in the near future, even hope to match. In the summer of 1963 alone, over 15,000 protesters and marchers were arrested. In that same summer, immediately after being released from a Birmingham prison, Dr. King assembled roughly 1,000 black children at the 16th Street Baptist Church, and from there led a march in which every child was arrested. The next day, King assembled 1,000 more children and repeated the march, despite even more brutal police opposition. In total, an estimated 1,500 black children were arrested. Remember, all this was thoroughly televised. In an era when television was literally the only media platform in most American homes, other than printed content and radio, and there were only 2 channels. Footage of the marches and the resulting police brutality had to have been seen by a huge swath of the population. After seeing the full force of the state unleashed on children, Dr. King and the Civil Rights Movement soon won broad support amongst the American public.
So decades earlier in 1930, when Gandhi led his famous Salt March that initiated the Salt Satyagraha campaign, crowds of supporters ranging from 4,000 to over 100,000 at its peak. Keep in mind these numbers were reported by a pro-British newspaper who had an interest in downplaying the size of the crowds. By the end of the campaign that year, some 60,000 people were in jail in connection to Gandhi and the Salt Satyagraha, and thousands more had been injured or killed by police and military. Another point to highlight is that while American popular culture and public school education characterized both the Indian independence and
Spam. Let me get you out of it. Let's just go home.
Okay. Well, American popular culture and public school education characterized both the Indian independence and the civil rights movements as monolithic groups led by a single person using exclusively pacifist tactics. The fact is that they simply were not. The Indian independence movement was comprised of a multitude of leadership figures. Many were disciples of Gandhi and did practice nonviolence, but on the other hand, some were not.
So, most notably, among the militant wings of Indian nationalism was a young anarchist revolutionary named Bhagat Singh. On December 17, 1928, Singh and 3 comrades avenged a fallen activist beaten to death by British colonial police by shooting and killing an assistant superintendent of police and later a head constable during their escape. On April 8, 1929, Singh and a fellow revolutionary bombed the Colonial Central Legislative Assembly, causing injuries but no deaths. Although Singh was later captured and hanged, there is no disputing the effect his actions had on the revolutionary spirit of the people of India. reverence for Bhagat Singh, even the prestige held by Gandhi. One has to question why Singh's name is excluded when the history of Indian independence is retold in this country.
The militant wings of the civil rights movement are similarly ignored. Despite numerous legislative victories and the successive actions like the Mountain Press boycott, the mid to late 1960s saw explosive frustration and bitterness amongst African Americans at the agonizing slow pace of change, cruel violence perpetrated by whites, and extreme difficulty in getting anti-discrimination laws actually enforced. So, 1965 saw a massive six-day riot in the deeply impoverished black neighborhoods of Watts in LA, which sparked over 300 race riots in other cities across the country by the end of the decade.
That same year saw the rise of the Deacons for Defense, who often provided security for nonviolent organizers, including an incident in which local police attempting to disrupt protesting high school students were turned away by deacons brandishing shotguns. By 1967, two of the three main civil rights organizing bodies had reversed their stance on nonviolence, distanced themselves from Martin Luther King, and often carried firearms when working in the Deep South. On top of all this was the outspoken militancy of the Black Panthers and Malcolm X, who later were targeted for extreme state repression. It's incredibly dishonest of the left to dismiss out of hand the militancy within these two movements. Without the looming specter of organized political violence and full-scale revolts, it's seriously doubtful that either the British colonizers in India or the white supremacist institutions of the South would have considered making meaningful concessions. So if all of that felt like too lengthy of an aside, I apologize. However, considering the immense influence these two highly popularized movements have over the rhetoric and techniques of modern-day environmental and social justice organizing, I believe a full accounting of their history is actually critical to the future of our movement.
So, while there's a tremendous amount we can learn from these struggles, the situation that environmentalism faces today differs in several key areas. The first is that we don't have a political situation where it's possible to force substantial change from those in power. Even the basic tasks necessary for sustaining government operations are subject to utter partisan gridlock, unless, of course, those tasks involve building drones or killing people. The second, and most obvious difference, is time. Here in 2014, we're so horrifyingly close to complete biotic and climactic collapse that the decades, if not centuries-long process of building an oppositional culture on a mass scale is tragically not a realistic option for us.
So another key difference is in numbers. Nonviolent mass movements require a population on a broad scale who understands what's at stake and are committed to political struggle in the deepest possible sense. Because effective nonviolent action requires intentionally provoking the most violent and brutal possible response from the opposition, the need for total and unwavering commitment cannot be understated.
For example, in India, during the March on the Darsan Salt Works in May of 1930, American journalist Webb Miller observed, not one of the marchers, and this is a long quote, not one of the marchers even raised an arm to fend off the blows. They went down like 10 pins. From where I stood, I heard the sickening whacks of the clubs on unprotected skulls. The waiting crowd of watchers groaned and sucked in their breaths in a sympathetic pain at every blow. Those struck down fell sprawling, unconscious, or writhing in pain with fractured skulls or broken shoulders. In 2 or 3 minutes, the ground was quilted with bodies. Great patches of blood widened on their white clothes. The survivors, without breaking rank, silently and doggedly marched on until struck down. So, if you believe in strict nonviolence, honestly ask yourself, could you really keep marching? Even after watching your friends and comrades go down like 10 pins in front of you with policemen's clubs, tear gas, or bullets. Could you honestly send others to do this, knowing for a certainty that they'll be named or killed? Can you mobilize not just a few hundred, but thousands of people, day after day, potentially for years, into this kind of struggle? No? Then it's time to start considering some other tactics.
Bill McKibben is wrong. Waiting for a truly mass movement to arise is not a luxury environmentalists can afford, and what hope do we have? Surprisingly, some of the most stunning and effective resistance efforts in history were conducted not by the masses, but by small numbers of highly dedicated resistors. One of the most successful movements against oil extraction to date has been MEN, which stands for the Movement for the Emancipation of the Niger Delta. The area was being ravaged by Shell, and just a few hundred people took on both the Nigerian military and Shell's private mercenaries. It won popular support among the Niger Delta community. More importantly, those few hundred people that managed to make a significant reduction in oil output from the region, which is something the mainstream environmental movement can't boast by any stretch of the imagination. The French resistance to German occupation during World War II played a significant role in facilitating the Allied advance through Europe, and active resistors to the Nazi occupation of France were composed of about 1% of the population. Supporters, judging by how many people were reading the underground newspaper, were as much as 10% of the population, but active resistors. Those who were organizing strikes, gathering intelligence on the German military, sabotaging arms factories, attacks on the electrical grid, telecommunications, attacking German forces, and also producing underground media content about these activities. These folks were a very small segment of the population, about 1%, hardly a mass movement.
So the Irish Republican Army, which fought the British occupation of Ireland, is a similar case with regards to numbers. At the peak of the Irish resistance, when they were the most active, they had about 100,000, which is just over 2% of the population. And of that, only 15% of those were guerrilla fighters. 15,000. And they had 700 years of resistance culture to draw on. Another movement that we like to draw reference to in regards to this is the movement for women's suffrage. And it's often misremembered as being won solely by nonviolent means. So in Britain, women started out with pickets, lobbying, letters to the editor. But when these tactics failed, some suffragists moved on to direct action, such as chaining themselves to railings outside the Prime Minister's home, and to actually going and casting ballots illegally, which got them arrested. So after a protest in 1910 turned into a near riot due to brutal police beatings of protesting women, the movement began to wage guerrilla warfare, orchestrating systematic window smashing campaigns and arson attacks. The slogan of this movement was "Deeds, not words." They were imprisoned and tortured for their efforts, yes, but in 1918 they did win the right to vote. Again, this fight was won by a diversity of tactics. So none of this is to say that broad popular support would not be welcome. But to claim that a peaceful mass uprising is the only strategy that should be considered demonstrates a kind of willful disregard for the lessons of history. Mass movements tend to form only after small groups of highly committed people take decisive action and exploit the weaknesses of those in power, proving to others that they can be beaten. So if broad revolutionary conditions don't appear to exist, history does show us that the actions of small groups can create them.
Pacifism is the de facto premise under which the vast majority of mainstream environmental activism takes place. Sierra Club Conservation Director Bruce Hamilton recently stated, "The Sierra Club strongly condemns all acts of violence in the name of the environment. That type of criminal behavior does nothing to further the cause of promoting safe and livable communities." I would suggest to Mr. Hamilton that he tell that to the trees, or the wolves, or the salmon that are still breathing due to the forest or land defense tactics that are considered criminal in the eyes of the government and the corporations that run it. By the way, the Sierra Club accepted over $25 million in donations from Chesapeake Energy between 2007 and 2010. Chesapeake is one of the biggest gas drilling companies in the U.S., and a firm heavily involved in fracking. This leads to the next point, which is that pacifism is a doctrine preached and indulged primarily by the privileged. Even Gandhi, and to some extent Martin Luther King Jr. as well, while both members of oppressed classes, were comparatively privileged within their respective communities. For example, Gandhi studied law in England and was financially supported by others during his experimentation with nonviolence. It should also be noted that both these figures were men.
So a lesser-known example that we'd like to bring to light is the late Nelson Mandela, the longtime South African anti-apartheid revolutionary. Mandela's anti-racism and peace-promoting legacy is promoted by liberals and pacifists from all walks of life. But many are unaware of his vocal support for sabotage against industrial infrastructure, or the fact that he founded the Umkhonto Sizwe, the underground militant wing of the African National Congress. He's quoted here saying, "I do not deny that I planned sabotage. I did not plan it in a spirit of recklessness, nor because I have any love of violence. I planned it as a result of a calm and sober assessment of the political situation that had arisen after many years of tyranny, exploitation, and oppression of my people by the whites."
Doctrinaire pacifists would probably have tried to dissuade Mandela from his involvement in sabotage, and failing that, they probably would have condemned him for taking part in the destruction of infrastructure. This is because pacifistic principles do not differentiate between forms of violence. To a pacifist, using violence to, say, defend your homeland from an invasion is no different than using violence to invade the homeland of another. In other words, there is no distinction between means and ends. Violence is violence is violence. And if that's true, and defensive violence is as morally reprehensible as offensive violence, then maybe it's time we take a step back and ask ourselves, what's violence?
So, a definition that we could probably all agree on is that violence is anything that causes harm to another. So, therefore, by that definition, we can basically say that picking a mushroom and eating it is violence. But so is gunning down children from a helicopter. So obviously, these are vastly different acts, but so we have to actually change the question and ask, what forms of violence are socially acceptable? So in this culture, killing dozens of people in an oil train derailment, or poisoning a river with mining chemicals, or filling the air with radioactive particles are clearly all equally socially acceptable forms of violence. Since people who take part in these acts often profit greatly with no repercussions commensurate to their crimes. Yet any decisive acts, violent or not, taken to stop these people are generally socially unacceptable. So part of our mission as above-ground activists is to flip this inversion of ethics by challenging the acceptability of certain forms of systematic violence, while normalizing other forms of violence used in service of resistance. So pacifism, however, makes none of these separations. Ironically, the inability to differentiate between offensive and defensive violence can only stand to benefit exploiters and abusers. It is a detriment to those who are
Pacifism is also wholly dependent on the faith that on some level all human beings have a conscience and a fundamental sense of right and wrong, which can be appealed to with the right combination of words or symbolism. Whether this is true or not doesn't matter. Neither words, symbolism, or rational argument would have stopped Hitler. They would not have stopped Ted Bundy. They would not stop capitalists, and they will not stop the U.S. government. Even if you convinced key members of the corporation to see the error of their ways, they would simply be fired and replaced. I believe the systems of power we are up against are utterly inhuman and extremist beyond reason. The only language they understand is the language of force.
Yet it's the people who stand up and take action against these systems of power who are labeled as violent terrorists. Even those who take nonviolent but illegal actions are still condemned by mainstream environmentalism. This is insane. The corporations for which the laws are written are the very corporations that are governing the planet. If our actions are effective whatsoever, they are probably illegal or seem to be illegal. So just ask activist Tom Christopher, who found out that something as nonviolent as bidding on land against oil companies is criminal. Ask Occupy protesters, who found out that occupying public space is criminal. If activists accept the line between legality and criminality as a line that cannot be crossed, they accept the idea that activists should only take actions sanctioned by the very people whose power we should be challenging. The state tends to criminalize or classify as violent any type of action that might work to challenge the status quo. And as we've seen, the historical examples so often used to back up strict nonviolence fall down on closer examination of basic history. Again, we're not claiming that nonviolent tactics failed. In fact, we know that nonviolence works. However, nonviolence must be used as just one tactic amongst a diversity of tactics in our activist toolbox. Often it's the prospect of armed revolt, be it real or perceived, that provides sufficient motivation to those in power to come to the bargaining table with nonviolent activists. It's sort of like a good cop, bad cop situation. In order to play the good revolutionary, you need the bad revolutionary.
So many struggles throughout the world and throughout history have resorted to political violence, not because of a lack of compassion or a loving kindness, but because they didn't have the privilege of any other choice. We already mentioned MEND, and MEND is not a nonviolent group. They are an armed militia. And they use tactics from sabotage to kidnapping oil executives in order to defend their land and their people. The land is being utterly decimated by oil extraction. The people live in poverty, despite the Nigerian government making millions from the oil-rich area. The tactics MEND uses are a last resort. Before MEND, the resistance in the Niger Delta was primarily nonviolent and was led by a man named Ken Saro-Wiwa. Ken Saro-Wiwa and his group, Movement for the Survival of the Ogoni People, never deviated from their commitment to nonviolence. Even as Ogoni resistance leaders, were being routinely murdered, both by oil company thugs and legally through state execution. In 1995, despite a massive human rights outcry from around the world, Ken Saro-Wiwa was executed on false charges by the Nigerian government. Along with 8 other Ogoni resistance leaders. As Orwell pointed out, the Nigerian government and the oil companies it serves can stand moral force until the cows come home. It has no effect. But the physical force of men's tactics were able to reduce oil output from the region by 1/3 between 2006 and 2008. So whose interests are served by omitting militancy from both our current debate and the historical record? It is in the interest of governments and corporations that we never seize the physical force to actually stop them.
So, however, plenty of people around the world are seizing that physical force, and they have been throughout history. Rural peasant communities in Transylvania have sabotaged natural gas exploration by ripping up miles and miles of seismic test cables. In January, ELN guerrillas in Colombia detonated explosives, destroying 4 crude oil holding tanks along the Cañon Limon Provincias pipeline. Also recently in South America, members of the indigenous Mapuche people whose land has been under siege by the Chilean government on behalf of extractive industries were twice able to set fire to and destroy timber company aircraft. They were able to do this despite the use of surveillance drones and with infrared cameras and heavily policing military methods. Another example is the resistance to fracking by the Mi'kmaq First Nations and others in so-called New Brunswick, Canada. An oil drilling rig was set ablaze, and seismic thumper trucks were seized by resistors. In a brutal paramilitary raid by the RCMP to retrieve the vehicles, unknown saboteurs burned 6 RCMP police cars to the ground. And yet another example of resistance through physical force is that instead of accepting the Brazilian government, ignoring their voices and sentencing their way of life to be destroyed, hundreds of indigenous demonstrators occupied and began to manually dismantle the Belmonte Dam construction. So these are the kinds of direct, uncompromising resistance that we should be vocally in solidarity with, or at least not outright condemning.
So a stunning case study on the value of well-executed underground operations can be found in the actions of Agenda 21, a clandestine group of Norwegian saboteurs who have claimed responsibility in the sinking of 6 whaling ships since 1996 and remain completely at large to this day. Their technique is simple and identical in each attack. A whaling ship is selected, scouted, and boarded at night. Saboteurs open saltwater intake valves in the engine room, escape into the darkness, and the ship sinks to the bottom. In Agenda 21's own words, regarding a successful scuttle in 2009, we came to Henningsvada, we saw the Skarbak, we sank the bastard. While very little is known about Agenda 21's tactics and organization, as outsiders, we can analyze some of the factors contributing to their successes based on the limited information we do have. Agenda 21 clearly understands the concept of identifying a target's weak points and exploiting them. This has the effect of maximizing the results of their actions while minimizing the risk for their saboteurs and for bystanders. On a strategic level, this low investment of risk, money, and other resources allows Agenda 21 to fight an effective war of attrition, drawing down the enemy's capacity to operate through sheer frequency of attacks on relatively accessible targets. With a whaling fleet of less than 20 ships as of 2012, the loss of 6 ships is a significant blow to Norwegian whaling, even if in the short term, the total number of whales they kill has not drastically declined. The operations of Agenda 21 represent a rare instance where using a strategy of attrition makes sense. Any given whaling vessel in the Norwegian fleet is vulnerable and difficult to replace. Losing one ship undoubtedly drives up insurance costs for the whole fleet and deters investment in new whalers.
Unfortunately, attrition seems to be the default strategy of both above-ground and underground environmentalists, regardless of whether or not the delicate calculus of strategic factors are actually in their favor. Think of the sheer amount of time, effort, resources, and money poured into organizing our campaigns. Think of all the protests, the blockades, the lawsuits, the lobbying of regulators. All of this is just to defend a few remaining wild places temporarily. All this just to stop new projects from going forward. To say nothing of of the ongoing industrial onslaught and the destruction we were too late to avert. So So even in rare cases when people have taken up militants and escalated their activism to property destruction or terrorism, such as choosing symbolic targets over materially critical infrastructure. So ultimately, the industrial machine can definitely withstand the loss of an SUV dealership or even 100 SUV dealerships, or 6 mailing ships for that matter. But it's the key nodes of energy and transportation infrastructure which can constitute a real glass jaw of any industrialized economy.
So let's take a look at the narrative we began with. By raising awareness about the issues, we will create a shift in consciousness. A shift in consciousness will spark a mass movement. The mass movement can successfully end the murder of the planet by using exclusively pacifist tactics. I hope that we've been able to demonstrate that while there are underlying truths within this narrative, there's critical information that is left out. And as a result, our strategy based on this narrative has largely been a failure. We need to rewrite our strategy. We need to plant our feet firmly in the lessons of history and the grim realities of our present and formulate a new narrative. Education is vitally important, but we can't expect raising awareness to galvanize most people into action, especially when action would threaten their privilege and entitlement. Popular support is valuable, but resistance has often been carried out by small groups of determined people, not by mass movements. Nonviolence can be a powerful and elegant tactic, but winning strategies are marked by a diversity of both peaceful and militant tactics. So what does this mean for our actions? How can we incorporate this information into our strategy? And the first is that we need to vocally challenge some of these myths about nonviolence and pacifism and mass movements. And we really need to contextualize the successes of both Martin Luther King and Gandhi within the proper historical framework that existed when they did those actions. We need to support extra-legal resistance, both rhetorically and materially. And by that I mean in our sort of activist circles and in our personal lives, if and when an act of sabotage occurred, not outright condemning it and really normalizing that type of action. And then, of course, we can do things like direct action trainings in local communities, skill shares, and self-defense trainings for press classes. We also need to support our political prisoners. We need to write letters to them if they have families, provide childcare and support, and of course, donating legal funds. And then a quick note on security culture. Everything we're doing here is what's considered above ground. My name's Carson Wright. You can find me on Facebook. I don't hide my identity in any way. The whole point of above ground activism is to be visible. But unfortunately, that means that there are a lot of courses of action that are denied to us because it would not be practical, safe, effective, or strategic for me to be talking about this publicly and then also be carrying out these actions. And so there needs to be a strict firewall between our above ground and below ground movements. In her accounts of her experience in the Black Panther Party, Asada Shakur talks about how these blurring these lines between above ground and below ground actions led to a ton of security problems, and the state was so easily able to infiltrate and dismantle their movement. And of course, our language. We've given this talk before, and literally one of the first questions someone incriminated himself and said, "Well, if we get so and so to stop the pipeline, we don't have to go and sabotage, X." And it's like, well, if that happened tomorrow, like you just incriminated yourself. You said we. So our language has to be very specific, and there are guidelines out there for how to use language in a safe and strategic way. I mean, nothing's perfectly safe. Obviously, the government will break their own rules to cripple our movements, so we'll break their own laws. So security culture keeps us safer, but just understand that it's not completely safe.
So when we're talking about the cost of life on this planet, the cost of the culture culture we've all been born into. And the unsettling necessity of political violence in the face of this, it's easy to want to sugarcoat things. People want you to sugarcoat things. They say we can't take away the people's hope. And honestly, and excuse my language, but fuck hope. We don't need it. And as one author put it, hope is a longing for a future over which you have no agency. In other words, you only need hope in situations in which you are truly helpless. Those who do have the power, who are using that power to murder the planet, have written a narrative that gives them a monopoly on that power, a narrative that covers up the power that we could potentially wield to stop them. Every day that we abide by their rules and accept the narrative that serves their power is another day that's waste. But every day is also a new chance to rewrite that narrative, to change the story. With a truer understanding of the past, we can form a more effective strategy for the present. With a more effective strategy in the present, we can reject an unimaginable future on the dying planet that they have us headed toward. So in conclusion, with everything, literally everything, and everyone that matters at stake, it's time to do what we can with what we have. And it's time to claim that legacy of resistance that these and other examples of silent history